So what if power armoured super soldiers but with massive warp magic to shield their friends and confound and destroy their foes? Let's talk about the Space Marine Librarians in Warhammer 40K 10th edition. Hello and welcome back to Auspex Tactics, where today I thought we'd talk through Games Workshop's Librarians that they have on offer, talk through each model, their rules, and rate them roughly how powerful I'd consider them in game at the moment on a scale of 1 to 5. In the lore, the Librarians are the Space Marine battle psychers, battle brothers with psychic gifts that have survived the chapter's selection process and have displayed utmost mastery over their powers, that the risky business of calling on unnatural forces for aid in battle isn't going to pose more threat to the chapter than the good it will do. These battle psychers employ all sorts of warp magic, and many of them fitting in with the chapter's strategies, whether it might be to unleash the melee rage of the Blood Angels, or to call the living lightning of the storm for the Space Wolves. Other than their battlefield duties, the Librarians maintain the Librarius, based on the records of the chapter's deeds and combined knowledge, and often stand somewhat apart from their battle brothers, given that psychic gifts generally aren't seen as a positive in the Imperium, and for the vast majority of psychers out there, the chapter's general policy is to abhor and destroy. In-game in 10th edition, the Librarians' rules have been a little bit more simplified from 9th and before. Previously, you'd often have big tables of spells that they could pick from, but now these psychic powers come basically baked into their datasheets, so they don't really get choices of which sort of magics they're going to employ. Compared with a few of the other characters in the codex, though, it does mean that they have some wild and wonderful things going on in each different datasheet, most individual Librarians operating very differently to another, as opposed to things like lieutenants with their lethal hits or captains with their free stratagems. Beyond that, they generally provide a bit of protection against psychic damage, though they do have the downside of giving their unit the Psyker keyword, which does mean that certain anti-Psyker attacks just are rather good against them. In any case, let's jump straight in and talk through every single variant of Librarian and roughly how strong it is in-game. First up, we've got the standard issue Librarian, formerly known as the Primaris Librarian, as that's the model that you use for it now. He's 65 points and has really quite a big choice of units that he can lead, generally intercessors and pretty much any of the fire support type units. The standard Librarian's combat stats maybe aren't enormously exciting, they're fairly fragile characters compared with the ones that get invulnerable saves, only 4 wounds and a 3+ save to protect them, so they're definitely a bit more susceptible to things like sniper fire than most, and in general their force weapons are okay but not standout in combat. This guy gets 4 attacks, weapon skill 3+, strength 6, AP 1 and damage D3. For their ranged attacks, these standard ones all get the Smite attack, a witch fire that you can either use on safe mode with D6 shots at strength 5 AP 1, or boost it up to the hazardous mode, where you get strength 6 AP -2 and also devastating wounds. In general, I think Smite is handy enough to have, usually you get around about 2 or 3 slain termagants or guardsmen, 1 or 2 standard space marines which are probably its ideal targets, and at least on the hazardous mode it's quite good against Terminators, maybe doing around about 2 wounds to a Terminator squad on average. Otherwise, like a lot of the Librarians, he's got a Psychic Hood. It gives you a 4+ feel no pain against psychic attacks, which is handy but kind of niche. Some armies have them, but plenty don't. And then the really big deal for this guy, which is why you're actually bringing him at 65 points, would be the 4+ invulnerable save. While he's leading a unit, they just get that no questions asked, and they don't need to roll to cast it each turn unlike some other powers. Overall, I'd certainly say that that's the main draw to bringing him. The Smites, the Force Weapon, and the Psychic Defense are okay, but not so exciting that you go out your way to get them. So it really depends on whether your unit needs that 4+ invulnerable. Admittedly, I think it is kind of nice for any 3+ save Space Marine unit. In general, things like Plasma Fire with a high AP and damage 2 can be really good at killing them. So it definitely makes the squad a bit more survivable. But you might well need to weigh up his points cost versus dedicating his points towards more points of the same unit in a different squad. I feel like with a 5-man squad, you're just not getting enough value out of that invulnerable save to really justify his inclusion, so you're probably looking at a 10-man squad. And overall, I'd say perhaps the best option for him might be the Hellblasters. Fairly expensive marines where if they can survive a round of enemy firepower, getting to hit back a second time would be kind of nice. He will be competing against other characters though, like say the Primaris Lieutenant, who allows you to get lethal hits with a unit which is very good for mid-strength firepower, plus his being able to fall back and shoot is pretty nice as well. Otherwise, he could make an abnormally tanky Intercessor squad or Stern Guard squad, but you probably need to weigh him up against putting the points towards more squads of those. At 65 points, you're not really too far off getting another entire squad of Intercessors on the board, which might be the better deal overall. Overall, I feel like he's usable, but maybe not too stand out in the Space Marine HQ lineup. Probably enough value to justify using him at 65 points if he takes some specific units. He does make the squad tougher, and he does chip into damage, particularly with that Smite. Overall, I've decided to rank him 3 library books out of 5. Moving on, we've got the spooky sneaky librarian in Phobos armor. He's 70 points and basically has the choice of leading most of the Phobos foot troops, the incursors, infiltrators, reavers, or eliminators. For the most part, his stats are really quite similar to the standard librarian. He gets the same issue smite plus a force weapon, which I think is actually kind of nice to add into a Phobos armor unit. They don't usually tend to get any decent melee weapons really. He gets the infiltrators keyword, so he can forward deploy with eliminators or infiltrators if it makes sense to. And rather than getting a 4+ invulnerable save special rule, instead he gets the shrouded special rule that kind of gives the unit lone operative, can't be shot outside of 12 inches, and if the enemy does manage to make it into that range, then they still get stealth as well, so a -1 to hit up close. Overall, it does make him into a kind of interesting choice. Being an extra 70 points, it means that you are putting quite big in value investment in a unit, but in general I think it's still going to be worth it to put the lone operative ability on a small unit, as generally you want it to be something that's fairly low investment to hold points and things. You could put him in a big 10-man unit of reavers or infiltrators or something, but I feel like that's probably overkill really. Even if you mash them up and hit them with other synergies and stratagems and things, they're still not going to be a good damage output unit. So in general, when I've seen people using him for competitive, it usually tends to be in a unit of 5 infiltrators, just to kind of have some pretty godly presence on one objective. Infiltrators get the option to prevent deep strike within 12 inches of them, which makes for an objective that's very safe from enemy reserves, and the Phobos Librarian special rule means they can't be shot outside of 12 inches. And between the two of those, it means unless the opponent can actually physically move units right up to that objective, they're not going to be able to take it with special movers or utility units or options that can drop just outside of 3 inches of the target. Overall, I think it's still quite a big investment. That's 170 points for a 5-man squad of them plus the Phobos Librarian, but does seem to be strong enough to make his way into competitive lists, and for that reason I've chosen to rank him a full 5 out of 5 on the library book scale. Moving on, we've got the Terminator Librarian, of recent fame from the Leviathan box set. He is now 75 points, going down from 90 in the last Codex update, and he can lead either Terminators or the Terminator Assault Squad. His basic options in Smite and his Force Weapon are pretty much the same as the previous two Librarians, a little bit of anti-elite shooting, plus will chip in melee, but not quite as much as some of the other Terminators with Power Fists perhaps. And he does provide just a little bit more shooting output as well, with either a Stormbolter or Combi Weapon. He's tougher than the previous Librarians due to the Terminator armor. He gets a big 5 wounds, toughness 5, with a 2+ save with a 4+ invulnerable, so a fair bit more value there. He can deep strike alongside the rest of the Terminators, and rather than giving them a defensive buff like the previous two Librarians, instead he makes them a bit more dangerous on the attack, giving them sustained hits 1 via Veil of Time. I feel like at 90 points he was probably a bit overcosted, and certainly in comparison to the Chaplain and the Captain, but at 75 points I feel like he's not the worst choice in the world if you just basically want to terminate a squad that does what it does just a little bit more efficiently. At 75 points is roughly the points cost of 2 Terminators, though maybe only has the durability of about 1.5 I'd say. The 5 wounds is technically a bit better than that, but he does still have the opportunity to get one-shotted by one massive attack, so it probably weakens the squad just a tiny bit on the durability front. However, between his own damage output and the sustained hits, if you put him into a 5-man Terminator squad, then I'd approximate that he's getting roughly around about an extra 3 Terminators worth of damage between his own attacks and buffing his own attacks and the rest of the squad, and that gets a lot more efficient when you're leading a 10-man squad as well. Overall, between those numbers, I feel like he's on paper justifiable. Doesn't really lose the squad too much defense per point, but gains them a bit more damage per point. Though I think at these numbers he's maybe not standout or auto-include or anything, as he's competing against the also pretty solid Captain and Chaplain. In general, the Chaplain's going to do better for them in close combat, particularly against heavies and things, and the Captain's a bit more detachment specific depending on which battle tactics you've got access to. Overall, between all that, I'd rate him as a kind of mid-tier character. I've rated him 3 out of 5 on the library book scale. Moving into chapter-specific librarians now, and first up we have Chief Librarian Tigurius for 75 points. I feel like he's an interesting sort of character with absolutely godly special rules in my opinion, though it's maybe just a little bit let down by what squads he can join. Given that he's only about the same points cost as the other librarians, I feel like overall he brings an absolute massive amount to the table. His Storm of the Emperor's Wrath is significantly more punchy than the standard Spite, basically getting double the attacks compared with that. His Rod of Tigurius is much better than the standard Force weapon, getting 5 attacks at Strength 7 and AP -2, so improvements all round there. His Hood of Hellfire provides some better defense, also working against mortal wounds as well as just against psychic attacks, so another improvement. He gets a 4+ invulnerable save, which the standard librarians don't. He gives his unit a -1 to hit, which is kind of handy, both when it's at range and in melee. And finally, as if that weren't all enough, he can give you a free Overwatch for 0 CP once per battle round. That should hopefully equate to just 3 extra damage at least once per game, if not multiple times. Overall, between all that, I feel like Tigurius is hard to go too far wrong with. His own damage output I think is fairly considerable as well. If he can shoot at some standard Space Marines, he'll kill around 2 or 3 of them, or around 5 Termagants with that Storm of the Emperor's Wrath. The -1 to hit's usually going to add around about 25 to 33% to a squad's survivability, and it's really quite nice that he gets that in melee as well as at range, plus specific double toughness against mortal wounds and psychic definitely doesn't hurt. I feel like in reality the biggest issue is which squad you'd really like him to join, as at the moment I feel like just about any of the options are just slightly suboptimal for him for one way or another. What he'd really like to join I think would be Hellblasters. They certainly love the free Overwatch that they can get from him, plus the extra defense, but unfortunately he seems to be locked out of them. In absence of that, I feel like Stern Guard Devastators or maybe even Standard Intercessors might be the way to go. I think he's a kind of weird character really, just because he provides so much value for so cheap, you could actually justify buying a unit to build around him rather than the other way around. I feel like for most characters you tend to buy the character to buff the unit, but I feel like weirdly you could justify buying maybe even a slightly suboptimal unit to justify Tigurius on the board. Maybe things like a 10-man Intercessor or Stern Guard squad could be surprisingly effective with his extra advantages. Overall, between all that, I've chosen to give him 4.5 library books out of 5. Absolutely excellent for his own value all the way round, just perhaps often gets passed over surprisingly often in army lists, just due to him being a character that you kind of have to go out of your way to design a unit for him rather than the other way around perhaps. Onto the Blood Angels, and we've got Chief Librarian Mephiston here. 110 points, and he has the option to lead the Assault Intercessor Squad, the regular Intercessor Squad, or the Stern Guard Veterans. Compared with most of the other Librarians, he's really got quite a fearsome stat line. A big Toughness 5, a 2+ save, 6 wounds, and a 5+ feel no pain means that he's just remarkably tanky comparatively. Most of the rest of the Librarians couldn't just eat a Lascannon blast or two and likely come out smiling. Otherwise, his smite version is Fury of the Ancients, a focus witchfire that can get sustained hits 3 with strength 5, AP 2 and damage D3, still fairly good against Space Marines, plus a plasma pistol as well. Not too bad damage output, but if you are making 2 hazardous rolls then he is probably going to be taking some mortal wounds fairly quickly. In melee he strikes with Viterus, strength 9, AP 3 and damage D3 with 6 attacks hitting on 2s, so again significantly more punchy than most Librarians, and in the Blood Angels unique detachment if you're using that he'll be up to strength 10 and 7 attacks on the charge. Finally for his psychic buffs he has the Quickening, which allows you to get fights first for the unit, really quite big if the unit gets charged, and he also doubles down on melee defense with Transfixing Gaze as well, usually worsening the enemy's weapon skill by 1, so his unit won't be hit quite as well in close combat. Again, I feel like Mephiston is really quite let down by the units that he can join perhaps. He does have some nice advantages, though comes with a much heftier points cost than most to make up for it. His stat line and personal toughness are quite good, and fights first is really quite handy for an assault unit. Again, the biggest issue with him is the amount of squads that he can join. If you want a melee capable squad, then he's only really going to be attaching to the assault intercessors as a melee choice. Really, he'd ideally want to be attaching to Blade Guard or some form of Blood Angels combat specialists, but I don't think he can join Death Company due to not being a chaplain. Overall, I'm just not really sure that even with these stats, he's quite interesting enough to really carry the Assault Intercessor squad into a big squad that you really want to take 10 of plus him. For 270 points worth of fighty Blood Angels, you can get some much scarier stuff, like the same amount of Death Company and jump packs with Power Fist and Inferno pistols, for example. Overall, again, for that reason, I'd rate him as a bit on the underwhelming side. I've given him 1.5 library books out of 5. Will probably need to be a bit cheaper than he is to really get play with Assault Intercessors or have more options to lead units. Mephiston isn't the only Librarian that the Blood Angels can put on the table though. They also have access to their Librarian Dreadnought, 170 points as a standard Dreadnought sort of stat line. He doesn't have the character keyword anymore. He basically has a similar sort of stat line to the standard Firstborn Dreadnought. He moves only 6 inches, but has some excessively punchy stats when he's in close. The Furioso Fist gets AP 3, which a bunch of the other Dreadnoughts don't do, and he also gets an extra attack with the Furioso Force Halberd as well. An interesting combination of mid-strength at strength 9, but a huge damage characteristic at d6 plus 3 if it does sneak a wound through. Beyond that, he gets some small arms built into his fist, plus he also gets to attack with the Blood Lance, a Witchfire at 18 inches. This one's a serious anti-tank shot with a single shot at strength 12, AP 3 and damage d6 plus 3, plus the potential to kind of go nuclear if he rolls a 6 to hit, as that's got sustained hits d3 as well. Beyond that, he gives you an aura of feel no pain type saves against mortal wounds and psychic attacks, Maybe that was a bit more meaningful once devastating wounds were mortal wounds, but now they're not. And finally, perhaps the single most exciting thing about him is Wings of Sanguinius, a 2+ chance to teleport some Adeptus Astartes infantry across the board, potentially deep striking them somewhere else that's threatening to the enemy right from turn 1. Overall, that Wings of Sanguinius would definitely be the biggest reason that I'd want to take the Librarian Dreadnought. I feel like most of his stats are just kind of okay and hold their own, provided you're getting good value out of the teleport. And despite all the Blood Angels melee rage that they have going on, I think it's usually going to be a better idea to teleport something that's got some good firepower, as then you pretty much guarantee get to deal some good damage and not just relying on getting very lucky on a 9-inch charge out of Deep Strike. He's quite commonly used to teleport things like Aggressors or Hellblasters across turn 1 to activate the Gladius Fire Discipline combo. And another really solid unit that he can teleport are Eradicators as well. They're pretty much ideal for him as well, wanting to get into close range of an enemy tank or vehicle, and this could allow them a lot better setup options compared with, say, coming out of Strategic Reserve. For things like the Aggressors, they could still maybe threaten a 9-inch charge if they don't just completely annihilate whatever they were close to, but I feel like that is going to be a bit of a gamble. Just having the option to teleport other units around the board isn't the worst as well, could help out with secondaries. Otherwise though, he's kind of nice as a countercharge threat, but he is fairly painfully slow moving, so if the opponent doesn't want him to catch any one unit, he's probably not going to be able to, and any sort of dedicated anti-tank firepower will bring him down really quite quickly, only toughness 9 and 8 wounds, even with a good save. Overall, between all that, I've rated him a 4 out of 5. I feel like he's probably auto-include good if you are running the Gladius task force, but perhaps just a tiny bit more take or leave if you're running one of the other detachments. Still very nice with Eradicators and things though if you want to go that way. Next up, for 75 points, we've got Ezekiel of the Dark Angels. He's one of the characters that's really waiting for Games Workshop to do an errata to the units that he can lead, as at the moment it lists the Command Squad, the Assault Squad on foot, and Vanguard Veterans on foot, all of which have now been moved to Legends, so that only leaves him with the Tactical Squad left. I'd guess when Games Workshop do eventually get round to FAQing that, they'll probably allow him to join most of the Primaris units, though what he does or doesn't get access to could be kind of big. For 75 points, I'd say the single biggest boost that Ezekiel gives is the Book of Salvation. He gives you a +1 to the attack characteristic of melee weapons by the model's unit. That could be very nice on a combat capable squad, say if he could lead some Blade Guard, but just isn't really all that exciting when he's locked to Tactical Marines. Otherwise, he's got a fairly punchy force weapon with AP2, and it's got Anti-Chaos 2+ if you happen to be fighting against them, and he trades out his Smite attack for a single precision attack called Mind Wipe. It can get devastating wounds on an anti-character 4+ if you go for the hazardous roll for it. Never really going to be a reliable way to kill a character, but it's certainly one that you could roll lucky for. Finally, he also hands out a Battle Shock test, gets a 2+ and a 4+ invulnerable save, and if he dies, then nearby Adeptus Astartes have to take Battle Shock test, which if you're playing in the Dark Angels Unforgiven detachment, then that could actually give you some positive effects. Overall for this guy, I just feel like he's maybe not the most exciting at the moment though. I think the single best draw to him is the +1 attack buff that he hands out, but not having any assault units that he can meaningfully give that to at the moment is a real downer. If he could lead Blade Guard Veterans, or just about any other on-foot assault type units, he'd probably be a little bit more interesting, though at the moment I'd probably rate him as one of the weaker Librarians overall. Next up, we've got Njal Stormcaller at 85 points. He's basically an alternative version of the Terminator Librarian with a few side grades and different abilities. Most of his stats are at least somewhat similar to the Terminator Librarian. He gets to attack with Living Lightning instead of the standard Smite. It's a little bit less AP, but it does get sustained hits too, and 2d6 attacks, so really quite nice against Horde models. On average, his Lightning attack can lay low around about 5 or 6 Termagants, so it'd help out your Terminators against chaff. Otherwise, his Staff of the Stormcaller gets him sustained hits 2 and a strength 7, so some small upgrades there compared with the base Librarian. His Psychic Hood works a little bit differently, as he uses a Runic Armor rule instead. It means that he's -1 to wound by psychic attacks, as opposed to the 4+ Feel No Pain, a bit of a side grade. And finally, for the buff that he gives a unit, he gives his Terminator units the Stealth keyword, so that's a -1 to hit at range, rather than the sustained hits. Again, that's probably the single biggest draw to use him. Terminators that are just a bit harder to lay low at range is certainly no bad thing, and he's not really all that expensive at 85 points. It does seem a bit of a side grade though when weighed up against sustained hits 1, particularly as the regular Terminator Librarian is cheaper, and it also allows you to select your choice of enhancements should you wish to upgrade him with something. Overall, I'd probably be a little bit more tempted by the regular Terminator Librarian, seeing that he's 10 points cheaper, but there's really not all that much in it. I've chosen to rate him 2.5 library books out of 5. Finally, for our tour through the Space Marine Librarians, we come to the Grey Knights, and they've got the Brotherhood Terminator Librarian. Compared with the rest of them, he's not operating out of the core codex Space Marines, so really quite different options with the Grey Knights Teleport Assault Force. The Brotherhood Librarian is 100 points, has a somewhat similar stat line, and he trades the Smite type attack for Purge Soul, swapping out to just a single Strength 6, AP 2 and Damage 3 shot that can be precision if you risk a hazardous roll. His melee attacks are kind of similar with the Strength 6, AP 1, but a more reliable flat damage 2 here. And rather than giving his units sustained hits or any sort of buff like that, he trades that all out for the rather fearsome Vortex of Doom, a potentially quite risky spell, but one that can have some pretty awesome effects with dealing some massive damage to the enemy. Usually you could expect around about 4 mortal wounds out of this to one enemy unit within 18-inch range of that, which is fairly respectable. That should be an enemy Terminator dead or a bunch of infantry. But there's some massive swings if you roll either a 1 or a 6. If you roll a 1, then you take d6 mortal wounds on your own unit, which is kind of huge. But if you happen to luck out and roll a 6, then he goes into absolute rage mode, 2d6 mortal wounds on the enemy unit. If you roll super hot, in theory that's all the way up to 12 mortal wounds out of a single spell, though on average you'd expect more like 7. That would still be enough to take a massive chunk out of just about anything in the game though. Overall, I guess Grey Knights will be considered a bit different to standard Space Marines, as they do operate with their own armies. Within the context of the Grey Knight Codex, though, Terminator Librarians do seem to be an absolute staple. They seem to appear in far more competitive Grey Knight lists than they don't. I think it's just partly because Grey Knights are often reliant on melee damage to get any serious damage on their opponents, and that's not actually necessarily all that easy to deliver with their teleports when they're dropping down 9 inches away, whereas the Librarian can deal some very reliable damage and also be one of the units that can actually put some hurt on some of the toughest stuff in the game with high toughness and saves. For that reason, at least in context of the Grey Knight army, I would consider him an absolute top tier choice, so I've given him the full 5 library books out of 5 here. Overall, putting that all together, here's just my very rough appraisal of roughly how strong the Librarians are right now. For the absolute top tier choices, I consider that the Phobos Librarian, Grey Knight Librarian, Tigurius and the Librarian Dreadnought. All for slightly different reasons. I'd probably put the Librarian Dreadnought as one of the absolute strongest if you're running Gladius with fire discipline and things, though maybe a little bit less pivotal if not. Otherwise, I'd say the standard and Terminator ones and Njal Stormcaller are kind of a bit so-so. Fairly reasonable if you just want to slant their squad in a slightly different direction, though maybe don't add anything absolutely outrageously powerful. And at the moment, probably the ones that need to go back to library school the most might be Mephiston and Ezekiel. I feel like they're both units that do have quite big potential, but really just need to be able to lead something that's actually genuinely good in combat, and if not, their potential is just going to be kind of wasted. Let me know your thoughts on the Psychers of the Space Marines though. Which ones would you rate to be strongest and weakest at the moment in Warhammer 40k, and have any of these been getting table time for you in 10th edition? If you've enjoyed the video, then feel free to subscribe to Auspex Tactics. I'll certainly keep the regular 40k videos coming. I do tend to post new ones just about every day. Finally, if you have been enjoying all the videos on the channel, I would just like to mention that Auspex Tactics does have a Patreon page as well, and you can find that down below in the video description if you'd like to help support and keep these videos coming. Channel patrons do get a fair few advantages, seeing certain videos early, regular votes to see what sort of things happen next on the channel, and automatic entry into the regular prize giveaways with a chance to win some really big model kits each month. If any of that sounds good to you or you'd just like to help support, the link is down in the video description. In any case, a massive thank you for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.